All right, so welcome everyone to another edition of the Rising Tide Foundation's lecture series on a harmony of interests, true inquiries into the true nature of the American system, which began as a smaller idea of just several classes to just paint a better picture about the real origins of 1776. What was that anomalous revolution all about in an English-speaking colony that broke away from the mother of the hive? What was that all about? How did that occur? Because it was obviously something more than simply people not wanting to pay taxes, or they got disenchanted with Indian tea. But as we saw in the last several weeks, this story goes back to really 1630 and before that, to the days of Thomas More, writing about utopia and the idea, the concept of moving civilization from the corruption and the rot of the oligarchical systems that had embedded themselves in the old world, and finding new and fresh terrain far enough separated from that process where a world of justice could be created, founded upon natural law. And for hundreds of years, a fight that we're not really given in our textbooks broke out. The period of John Winthrop Jr., later on, Increase Mather, Cotton Mather, and that whole process that was tied to the networks of Jonathan Swift in Britain, Leibniz, Robert Harley, pushed a process forward further and further that led into a young Benjamin Franklin being brought into early networks in the 1720s that saw really the seeds planted for what we then later on called the American Revolution. I'm just gonna let somebody else in here. Now, we've had a wonderful series of lectures going through Frederick Douglass, his relationship to Lincoln, the rise of the slave power, the fight for a secessionist movement in 1803 under Aaron Burr and some Canadian and British intelligence operatives to break up the Union way before 1861. Getting my dates all mixed up here. And this has been a fun journey, but we're going to continue this journey as we're going further and further. I mean, it's not just about America, it's about the world. So today we are going to continue our investigation into this world process of world history that shaped the environment of the United States, that shaped the environment of Europe and beyond, with a wonderful speaker, Martin Sieff, who is a friend of mine, and he's a co-author, along with Cynthia Chung here behind me, at the Strategic Culture Foundation. Martin is a veteran journalist, award-winning journalist who's been a correspondent around the world for many, many years. And increasingly, I've come to discover that Martin is an incredible historian, and some of his history research is just unparalleled. Many of these more recent pieces we've had the pleasure of publishing on the Rising Tide Foundation site, as well as on the Canadian Patriot site. And I included a link to several of them in the most recent email, which all of you received, which could accompany some of the content Martin is going to take us through in today's lecture. So Martin, I think I've said enough, and I'll just give you hosting privileges, Martin. So anybody who comes in at this moment, you have sole authority to admit them. And
okay, now the title you and I, of course, agreed on is extrapolated from a very recent article I've done, one of a series I'm doing for Strategic Culture Foundation. And the theme of this one is the first NATO. And I had an interesting genesis. I found I had to do no research for it whatsoever because I'd been saturated in the history of it for more than 50 years. I was trained in the British and specifically Oxford tradition of history. And that's still really the Macaulay liberal myth that the Anglo-American background is the greatest of all possible worlds. Now, I don't want to bash, in a sense, needlessly, either American or British historiography, because while there are great shortcomings to it, it's the shortcomings of human nature. And you find in any in any culture, looking at history is always done from a subjective and central egotistical position. The problem is that the very success of Anglo-American civilization in sweeping the world in the past several hundred years has swamped other cultures too. So there is no longer what the great Dutch historian Peter Gale called the necessity of debate in history. Peter Gale said the essence of history is not a search for the facts, it is a debate and argument that must always continue over the interpretation of the facts. And I found this to be enormously valuable and important. In my 20s, among the many very poorly paying, but theoretically prestigious and very interesting things I did, was I was a research historian, a research assistant on and off for many years, both in the Middle East and in Britain, for the late Sir Martin Gilbert, the official biographer of Winston Churchill. Now, if you look at Gilbert's work on Churchill, the official biography, it's utterly fascinating. It is the largest biography ever written, and although it has much useful raw material in it, as a work of history, scholarship, interpretation, it is utterly worthless, because Gilbert had endless energy and revered Churchill and produced around 10 to a dozen volumes, each 800 to 1,200 pages long, and then more than 20 volumes, we can look it up, or anyone can look it up while I'm speaking, of research material on it. And there is no critical interpretation whatsoever. And many of the most important issues in Churchill's life, and a follow-up session on this, I would be very happy to contribute or involve in deconstructing Churchill, which still needs to be done even half a century and more after he died. Here is a lifetime's work, revered throughout the world, especially by American conservatives and British conservatives, and as history. It's utterly worthless. It asks no significant questions. Now, when we come to the history of Britain and France in the 19th century, I learned this as a teenager at an outstanding school in Northern Ireland. It was an extraordinary place and still is. It was located only a couple of hundred yards from one of the most violent Irish Republican Army strongholds and ghettos. As a teenage boy, I used to have to get involved in nasty street fights where I learned the strategic value of getting the knee in first and gouging the eyes and then running for your life. There was no talk about Horatius on the bridge and gallantly holding up against further odds. You were up against young thugs from different backgrounds who saw your nice school uniform and were ready to break your bones and kick your limbs in and kick you in sensitive sexual areas. So you kicked hard, you fought dirty, and then when the odds were too great, you ran for your life, and there was no shame in it. And Harry Truman once said he was bullied as a boy and learned to run, and that was why he'd lived to become a senator and vice president and president of the United States. And with all his faults, with all the mess he made in Korea, he could have done worse. We at least didn't end up in a nuclear shooting war, which he was leading us towards, in fact, in the 1940s and early 50s. So that was my background. And at the same time, this was the external environment. I was at a school which was so good, it propelled me into Oxford University. It taught me the basics of French, Latin, German, and Russian in a working class part of Belfast City in Northern Ireland. I was exposed to the best that culture had. And I was also exposed by a series of outstanding teachers to the political history of the 19th century, from, of course, a liberal, Macaulay, English, Anglo-American triumphalist perspective. And I believed it all my life. And I only really started to question it from late middle age onwards in the last 20 years or so. And Jim, you and I have been friends and associates for much of that time. And I think you've seen much of that change in me, and it's still an ongoing change today. Now, I had a muse, an inspiration for this lecture, and he wouldn't like that to be the case. My inspiration was Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO. Exactly, Jim, because a few weeks ago, Stoltenberg whose own background is always buried and ignored in the media, and it's a terrifying one, not from being consciously sinister, but through being unconsciously criminally incompetent. Stoltenberg wants to expand NATO like any bureaucrat does. Beyond their aims of common sense, he wants to include Australia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, India. He wants to make an association of the democracies worldwide to quote unquote contain China and Russia. That is what he wants to do. And his close bosom buddy and soulmate, current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, gave the most extraordinary speech several weeks ago, which I have also deconstructed in another recent Strategic Culture Foundation article, in which he fits so many of the what are now cliches, but are the very sound principles from the Bible and the book of Proverbs, the definition of a fool. A fool, above all else, thinks he's wise in his own sight. And today we can put that in other terms. We have the Dunning-Krueger effect in psychology from two American psychologists about 20 years ago, which shows that the most creative and energetic people are like our host has just once again proven himself to be. They're insecure, they're always dissatisfied with their own outstanding performance, they always want to improve things and make it better. When you come across someone who thinks they're a genuine genius, whether on the right or the left, superficial ideology does not factor in here. They're always criminal incompetence, like the British generals who lost 1 million dead and 2 million casualties in World War I. They're dangerous idiots. And Stoltenberg fits this effect. When he was Prime Minister of Norway and had been so for 10 years, he lost 100 teenage children, the elite of his own party, from his own elite. This may have an interesting, either negative or positive effect, who knows, on Norwegian politics in future. 100 young people, just teenagers, were massacred by a single extremist lunatic. Of course, called a right-winger and a conservative, which he was neither. He was a radicalized, hate-crazed loon. And one man with an automatic weapon was able to go to this island where Stoltenberg's party was holding their summer seminar for their own teenagers, their leadership elite, and murder 100 of those young people in cold blood. Now think about this. This man, as Prime Minister of Norway, could not even protect 100 of the most cherished children and offspring of his own top ruling class colleagues, right? And what does he get for this? He is promoted to be in charge of the NATO. He is promoted to be in charge of the defense of the West, so-called, against the great, terrible threats of Russia and China. Now, this is terrifying. It ought to be terrifying. And nobody says the emperor has no clothes. Look at the silly emperor. Nobody says this, right? But I started to think recently. I looked at the absurdity of what Stoltenberg was saying, wanting to expand NATO to fight China and roll back China as well as Russia. The Secretary of State of the United States has just declared war on the stability of China. In his speech at the Nixon Library a few weeks ago, just last month, the Secretary of State of the United States says the United States cannot be satisfied with the government of China in its current state. We cannot rest until we bring democracy to China. Now, what is the actual history of China? We're going to see it right now, because the first time Britain and France brought democracy to China was in 1840 through the 1850s. And it cost between 50 to 80 million Chinese lives. It led to the greatest civil war and the greatest uprising in human history, the Taiping. And it created the first modern ISIS, or a precursor of the Nazi Party, a religious ideological movement that believed in exterminating every human being who did not accept the truth, and did so on a colossal scale, except it was not superficially based or putatively based on Islamic teaching. It was putatively based on Christian teaching, not real Christian teaching. It was a weird, evil, pathetic distortion. But then you could say the same things of communism in the Soviet Union and Nazism under Adolf Hitler. that they were weird distortions. Because if you give anyone power and the ability to convince enough people, you're going to have a genocide on your hand. Look where the Cambodian genocide stemmed from. It stemmed from Pol Pot doing a doctorate at the Sorbonne on urban planning, from which he decided that cities were a bad idea. And he extrapolated on that idea to an insane degree. Now, I would say the greatness of the American experiment lies precisely in the fact that with all its faults and shortcomings, which these seminars are brilliantly engaging too, the American seminar was the opposite of a philosopher's utopia. It was carried out by practical politicians who had just survived an extraordinary revolution and war, much of it the Civil War, by the skin of their teeth against the largest and most ruthless power the world had known since the Mongols, the British Empire. And Washington especially, and many and others too, were engaged with two issues. First, not carrying out crusades around the world, which is why, of course, they had survived only by the skin of their teeth. They were into survival. And all of them realized that just maintaining freedom and a national state was extremely unlikely. And they were pessimists too. The jokes we were spreading before are actually very relevant to what I want to engage here. And sure enough, as Matt has been the great pioneer in uncovering, throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, the United States was continually under threat, both externally and internally through subversion, by above all the British Empire. And this was widely recognized in America at the time. One issue I'm now starting to look at is, and this, we'll get back to the 1840s, but I did a recent article on the mechanics of assassination, of what was behind, how the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in Russia was actually carried out in 1881. And what I am now finding, to my astonishment, is that the same individual actors and the same mechanisms were employed in the assassination of President William McKinley in the United States in 1901. There's a continuity. There isn't just a pattern, there's a continuity of individuals at the highest level running this. In both cases, at my own Russian background, an ethnic Russian wife from New Jersey kick in with their prejudices here. They used a Polish assassin in both cases. It worked so well in 1881 with Ignach, I can never pronounce his name, you know, the guy who threw the infernal grenade, the second attempt on the life of the Tsar in 10 minutes. It worked so well that they recruited Leon Czolgosz, who was not just a useful idiot, which what they were looking for, but a useful Polish idiot to actually pull the gun on President McKinley. Now, there's much more involved in that, but the point was McKinley had pushed through he was the architect of major tariff legislation to tighten the economic screws from the United States in hostility to the British Empire. He was in the Abraham Lincoln, James A. Garfield tradition. He was in the tradition of, and I've written a book on this, on the history of tariffs. I had to give a lecture on Friday to a rather distinguished audience. There were about 30 or 40 people there, even in these days. And they were all people, all of them had at least one and usually several degrees in history and economics. And I asked, how many of you have taken courses in economics? 3/4 of the hands went up, right? And I said, how many of you have been taught that history shows that tariffs are the way for national wealth and that free trade brings devastation and destruction to populations on every occasion it is applied, right? All of them have done economic courses and none of them do this. And I said, I'm going to disprove all your years of economic indoctrination in 5 minutes. And I simply cited to them the Navigation Acts of Britain in the 1650s, Colbert's reforms, which these lectures, thanks to Matt, Diplomat's own presentation has so brilliantly pushed through the key to French economic rise and the final eclipse of Venice in the 1660s. Venice's own rise followed these same principles 400 and 500 years earlier. Britain goes to free trade liberalism at the very same time it is embracing the Confederacy, incidentally, in the 1860s. We look at this more closely later. In the Cobden Free Trade Act of 1860. Basically, the Cobden Free Trade Act is as idiotic as Secretary of State Frank Kellogg abolishing war in the Kellogg-Briand Pact in the 1920s. Remember how well that worked out? You just say, we abolish war, it's illegal. Ain't going to be no war anymore, right? Didn't work, did it? If you say the same thing, tariffs are evil, so we abolish tariffs. Other people don't. The key figure in this, I thought for a very long time, in fighting, and certainly Germany prospered enormously from this, was this extraordinary genius, Otto von Bismarck, one of the greatest political geniuses of all time, a man who did not just make his country militarily great, but he made it economically supreme in the world, and he did much more. He solved the great social issues of endemic poverty for the poor, the ill, the elderly, who will always be with us, as the Gospels rightly say, with social security systems so advanced that we have not caught up with them in the United States to this day. And in Britain right now, there is a great debate going on, a lot of soul searching. Why does Germany have lower COVID-19 fatality rates, both totally and per capita, than Britain? Britain has one of the worst rates in the world per capita, far worse than the United States, right? And I simultaneously see in the British media, and I hear from old friends from Oxford, from all over Britain, they acknowledge this and they say, well, it's all Boris Johnson's fault. But the NHS, the National Health Service, has been wonderful. When the British people lost their obvious empire, they got a new god for themselves, a new placebo to suck. The NHS, the National Health Service, which was supposed to be created in 1948, more advanced than any other health service in the world. It's not, it never was. Germany had a superior health service 65 years earlier, created by Otto von Bismarck. The socialist stream, in the best sense, was implemented by an ultra-conservative Prussian junker. Of course, as the genuinely great British historian Corelli Barnett says, it's very good to have wealthy, self-made landowners, as long as they're not too wealthy, in charge of your country, because they have a strong sense of profit and loss, of making profits from their crops, of looking good to their tenants, and they know how easily things can go wrong. They live in the practical world. They do not live in a world of theory. The most dangerous thing you can do is live in a world of abstract theory. Now, I always have very notorious long disquisitions and wind-ups like this. Let's get back to the 1840s and 1850s. Again, it comes from Jens Stoltenberg. If Stoltenberg's vision of a global NATO were to be implemented, and it probably will be, it's already well on the way to be implemented, we will see the same situation we saw before 1914. We're very close to it already. And that is two great blocs in the world determined on war with each other. Now, in theory, we had that between the United States and the Soviet Union after 1945. But we had one enormous benefit. It really isn't a benefit in the long term, but all our lives, it's been a benefit. Nuclear weapons, the nuclear deterrent, mutually assured destruction. Once the Soviet Union developed the bomb, it could not be destroyed without seeing Western civilization and the United States destroyed too. And they felt the same inhibition. And there was something else. The leaders of both sides, certainly Britain and France and the Soviet Union, and also those who had fought in the citizen armies of the United States through World War II, had experienced war at their first hand. They saw how horrible and dangerous and terrible it was. And they didn't want it to happen again. If you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, this constraint is operating at different levels on both Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had served in the Pacific, running a patrol boat. His boat was sunk by a Japanese destroyer. If he had not been the son of Joe Kennedy, he would certainly have been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for the genuinely impressive and even astounding bravery he performed. He had injuries from that experience that plagued him for the rest of his life. He was a sick man for the rest of his life. And Nikita Khrushchev had been at Stalingrad, Stalin's political commissar there, working with the top generals. He was Ukrainian. He saw the devastation that World War II caused in his native Ukraine. And he'd been a killer for Stalin before World War II. But World War II was too much even for Khrushchev. Khrushchev and Kennedy, when push came to shove, backed down from the horizon of nuclear war. We no longer have that kind of constraint working on our generation of so-called leaders in the United States and Britain today, and that is terrifying. But the idea of expanding NATO to a global alliance, it sparked my memory. And I went, this is Peter Gale again, that history is always needs to be reinterpreted because times are always different. Our perspectives are always changing. I do not believe in Einstein's relativity as a scientific principle. It's childish science. It assumes that space is empty, whereas we know since Hannes Alfvén, space is full of ionized gas plasma. So actually, we don't even need relativity, and it's just an intellectual argument. It's irrelevant. But we do need relativity in our history and our politics. We need to be able to see ourselves relative to the way other people see us, and relative to the different ways we saw ourselves in the past. Because I am astonished at the number of my friends, educated and often serious and influential people, who say to me, they have the magic solution. Americans, of course, are especially fond of magical solutions, so are Germans. You know, what's the principle? Democracies bring peace. You make every country in the world a democracy, there'll be peace. This is the neoconservative mantra, and the neoliberal mantra, of course, as well. Now, it's simply not true, because with the exception of Russia, which itself was even heading in the direction of Western democracy, much more than people give it credit for, Solzhenitsyn has often pointed out, in 1914, thanks to the great premiership of Pyotr Stolypin after the 1905 revolution. But every other country, including the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany, had free and fair elections, completely free and diverse freedom of the press, independent judiciary, trials by jury. All of this applied to them as well as to France and to Britain and to the United States and to Italy. It was democracies that went to war in 1914, with others joining in 1915. Not totalitarian states, it was democracies. Now, there were forces within all of those states, especially within the military, which were genuinely, as we had with Curtis LeMay and the Soviets clearly had too, there were sinister minorities within the military establishments that thought they could win quick wars. And the same incompetence was found in Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, Britain, and Russia, and later Italy. Churchill was right in this. It's very dangerous to trust your military too far. Trump has been doing that now. Obama did it before him. Bush was much more in the pockets of his military than either of his successors were. Much more. Bush Jr., catastrophic president, right? But we now go back to an era when we have two great democratic powers in the world, Britain and France, in the 1830s and 40s, and they are both industrially and militarily superior to everybody else in the world. The only people who can block them is each other. And France has been removed as a historic enemy from Britain by the destruction of Napoleon, his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. And what we then see over the next century in France, which neither the French nor the British or Americans remember today, is that France deferred to Britain on all issues of strategy and foreign policy from the defeat of Napoleon all the way into World War I. And this process reached its height under the extraordinarily bizarre leadership of the Emperor Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, for more than 20 years in France, from 1848 to 1870. But he inherits a tendency which he then accelerates. What we find, therefore, is in 1839, Britain, loyally backed by France, declares war on China. Why? In the interest of spreading democracy and free trade. Does that sound familiar? China will not join the new global norm of international trade and civilized life and law that the Macaulay triumphalist liberal internationalists in Britain, loyally followed by France, are determined to follow. But of course, there are economic interests behind this. The British Empire in general has a balance of payments problem. It wants to drink tea. The British have an insatiable appetite for tea, and they are developing the later enormous tea plantations of Assam in eastern India is in its very early stages. And steamship technology for transport of cargo is developing very rapidly, but has a long way to go. It will be another 20 years till after the American Civil War before mass trade of basic commodities around the world really reaches a modern scale. So the British are paying the Chinese an enormous amount in gold bullion and silver to get tea from them. And the Chinese are not interested in any British imports, except one. They have a drug problem, just as we do in the United States today. And the Chinese government then, much more energetically and sincerely than American governments over the past 30 to 40 years, is determined to exterminate its problem. And like Donald Trump, they believe in border security. Like Donald Trump, they believe in stopping drugs coming in at their borders, which in this case is the great ports, mainly Canton, in southwest China. And the British are outraged. By defending their sovereignty and defending their people from deadly drugs, not even heroin, just mere harmless opium coming in, the Chinese are committing affront against humanity and civilization. And this story is sold very successfully to the opinionated classes in Paris and most especially in London. And the British Navy very easily shoots the medieval 16th century technology gunpowder navy of China out of the water. That's the first Opium War. A flood of opium sweeps into China, right? Chinese civilization collapses under the impact. And what do people do when they despair? They look for extreme religious and political, especially religious solutions. A young Mandarin clerk fails his, called Hong, fails his examinations to enter the imperial civil service, much as Adolf Hitler, half a century later, failed his attempt to enter the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. And like Hitler, he finds a world of the mind he can explore again. He finds Christianity. But he soon decides Christianity is very imperfect and he can improve upon it. He comes to the conclusion that he is Jesus Christ's younger, improved version brother. He will succeed where Jesus failed. Whenever I tell this story in public lectures, I always pause here and say, whenever you come across someone who says they especially if they sound convincing, that they can do better than Jesus, and Jesus messed it up, run for your lives. Bad things always happen. What happens here is the Taiping, a movement, a religious revolutionary movement, more comparable in modern terms to ISIS than to anything else, that sweeps half of China, that within 10 years has 250 million people under its control. And it is absolutely merciless. If you are a traditional Taoist or Confucian, you will be burned alive, tortured before you're dead, have your head cut off, everything imaginable. If you are a traditional Christian, the same thing will happen, or a traditional Muslim. Or if you're one of the handful of Jews in China unwise enough to venture out of Shanghai into the southern half of the country at the wrong time. And eventually this revolutionary movement becomes so powerful, as on a much smaller scale ISIS did in 2014, as we recall, that even the great powers of the West are bestirred to act against it. And they give aid to the ramshackle government in Beijing they had previously worked so hard to destabilize. But of course, they take advantage of that too. There is a second Opium War because the British and the French decide there's much more money to be made from China than they're even making already. And the amount of wealth that comes to Victorian England and the United States from China, that is plundered from China via the opium trade in the second half of the 19th century, is colossal, and it affects everyone. It is not the basis of, it creates the fortune of the Roosevelt family, both the Theodore Roosevelts and most especially Franklin Roosevelt himself. And Franklin Roosevelt, a fascinating, complex man, generations and centuries ahead of his time in all the basic ways, but in some respects also a frightening and bizarre throwback to earlier times. In his own time, is very open about this. He admires his Delano ancestors for making money from the opium trade via New England clippers with China. Even when the ships had to sail all the way around Cape Horn, it was still worth making that effort. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt, with his Secretary of State, John Hay, maintains the open door policy into China of the United States, which is America's way to try and muscle its way into all the goodies that the British and the French have. This affects my own life. I told you the wonderful school I went to in Belfast. Anyone here ever seen, with your kids or grandkids, any of the Harry Potter movies? Right? Remember how Hogwarts has all the different houses in the school, like old British public schools always did. And the houses are always named after great founding father figures or benefactors who've given money to the school. My school to this day benefits from enormous funds that were given to it by a man called George Pottinger, Pottinger. I was in Pottinger House. I remember we had red colors, whereas, you know, the rival houses in our school, when we played rugby against them or cricket against them or soccer, they would be in blue or a wimp pink or yellow or green, which was disproved because it was a very pro-British, anti-Irish Republican school, right? But I was in all red Pottinger House, right? Well, the original Pottinger was one of the first governors of Hong Kong, and he made his money in the opium trade. And he fought with distinction from the British perspective in the war that destroyed Chinese civilization and basically crippled the Qing dynasty beyond in 1840. And I was the beneficiary of that wealth more than 120 years later. These events carry through history. But why was the war against China fought? It was fought by Britain and France, the true great democracies and free trade nations of the world, on the principles of Adam Smith, to extend civilization. And all the dupes in their own societies bought it. But this was only the beginning of the process. What we see in 1848, there is a revolution in France. And most revolutions don't turn out well. If you're incredibly lucky, you get a George Washington or the Matt Ehret of his time, somebody who really doesn't want power and is pulled into it kicking and screaming and gets out of it as soon as he can. There's much we can say on these lines. Have any or all of you ever been to Mount Vernon? There is enormous truth stirring people in the sight of Mount Vernon, so huge, everybody misses it. Mount Vernon is a nice place to live. It's comfortable. It's not a huge house, even by 18th century standards. It's not a huge plantation. It's on top of a hill above the Potomac River. The wind, when you have your veranda, even in summer evenings, when the hot baking Virginia weather, it's very pleasant to sit there. Washington loved his home. He loved going back there. He was not drunk on eternal power. He did not want to be the pioneer or let alone architect of a permanent political class himself. He felt he was always being pulled back from retirement to power and politics, and therefore he did a much better job of it. When people want, by contrast, the British Empire is effectively run for 40 years, from the mid-1820s to his death in 1865, by a man who is still a much beloved figure, and therefore needs to be reassessed in British history, Lord Palmerston. It is Palmerston who in the 1850s outrages liberal, at least some of his liberal principled critics, the Rand Pauls of the day, by threatening a war with the Turkish Empire because a single very sleazy and dishonest Greek trader, my apologies, Jim, who was also British at the time, had a British passport, exactly, is arrested by the Turkish Empire. And this is a wonderful pretext to put the screws on the Ottoman Empire and get more concessions for the British out of it, right? Which they do. And the Rand Paul equivalents in the Houses of Commons attack Palmerston. And Palmerston sweeps them aside with one of the most defining speeches in British policymaking in the last 200 years. And he says, just as any Roman citizen could walk the entire civilized world of his day unprotected as long as he could mouth the three simple words, civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, I am a citizen of Rome, of the Empire of the Republic. So, civis Britannicus sum, I am a citizen of the British Empire, should be sufficient for any one of our proud subjects to do their business freely and unrestrained anywhere in the world. The House of Commons loves it, the London mob loves it, right? Palmerston is invincible. And so what does Palmerston do with this power? First, he makes it bigger because he makes an alliance with the new emerging leader of France. France has a revolution in 1848. In the 19th century, they were always having revolutions. This one elects to power, as so often happens, a very anti-revolutionary and repressionist figure, a figure much more repressionist and tyrannical, as revolutions almost always produce, than the very liberal and ineffective monarchy that preceded it. The great nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Napoleon. Now, Louis Napoleon, in the long run, is exposed as a poseur. He more than meets his match in Otto von Bismarck, but that's 20 years in the future. But before then, he appears to be a much more impressive figure than his great uncle ever was. The great Napoleon rises from military conqueror of Italy to first consort of ruler of France, and then emperor, and then conqueror of Europe, and then starts losing it all again. He makes the mistake of invading Russia, always a bad mistake, right? And it all blows up in his face. Napoleon III invades Russia too, but it's a victory for him because he does it with the British, and Russia is at a particularly unusually weak space in this time. It's known as the Crimean War. In British and French history, it's just a little asterisk. But 1 million Russians died in that war, 1 million. So think about this. Here are Britain and France, and in the space of 20 years, they have declared war on China and brought it to its knees. They have declared war on Russia and brought it to its knees. The French also topple the fragile young democracy in Mexico and impose a French empire there, run by an Austrian archduke, the brother of the Emperor Franz Joseph, in the early 1860s, and the British look on this with approval. Now, American historians usually ignore this. The only place you can find a reference to it is in the westerns of Howard Hawks and John Ford, both of whom were well read in their American and Mexican history. All of John Wayne's wives, incidentally, were all Mexican. He had a great love of Mexican culture and the Mexican people. And there is, the United States is appalled by this, but there's nothing they can do. Because Britain and France, as Matt has pointed out here, and I think Matt's work is pioneering in a level that nobody has reached in this, and changes the context of everything we read here, and explains so much else. The British and the French are still determined to destroy the American experiment. And again, this plot has deep roots, and it has enormous repercussions. From 1825 to 1865, Lord Palmerston is the architect of British world power. And like the architects of American world power since Ronald Reagan, he extends the empire in the name of freedom. In the name of freedom. The British have abolished the slave trade in 1833. They actually sincerely do it. They pretend then they have a war on slavery, very similar to our war on drugs in the last 40 years. In the war on drugs, the drug problems in the United States have gotten steadily worse, and there are reasons for this. During the very period of time, we are told by Nancy Reagan to just say no. And one president after another has firmly jutted out his jaw and pretended to make war on drugs, when they never do. In the 1830s to the 1860s, The slavery trade expands to the United States at the very time the Royal Navy is declaring war on it. Now, the Royal Navy at the time is the supreme maritime force in human history. Even the United States Navy today has not reached the level of global superiority that with the technology of 200 years ago, the British were able to take for granted in the 18th and 19th centuries. For anyone who wants just an easily accessible, popular introduction to this without even going into histories, I wouldn't go with Admiral Mahon's ponderous and rather superficial book, The Influence of Sea Power on World History, which is very limited. I would go to the C.S. Forester Hornblower novels, which were written from the 1930s to the 1960s, especially a fascinating one called The Commodore, about the role, which basically, it glamorizes, of course, and it's enormously pro-British, but there's a wonderful guide to the influence of British sea power, even in the Baltic Sea, in bringing aid and comfort to Russia when Napoleon invaded it. But these are the Hornblower novels. Again, just as a popular introduction, the key point here is the power the British had and the way they did not use it. They used it to pretend to put down the slave trade, yet they did not put down the slave trade. During the years America was supposed to put down the slave trade, the volume of slaves recorded at East Coast American ports in the South, and the growth in the number of slaves, not just from natural increase, but from imports, because of course the death rate among slaves, especially children and elderly ones, was exceptionally high, right? And yet slavery grows in the era of Andrew Jackson and popular democracy from 1828 to 1860 at a faster and greater rate than it has ever grown before. How could that happen if the slave trade internationally had been abolished and was suppressed? It was, of course, because the British and the French were playing double games. They were playing double games. Now, when we come to the issue of British and French subversion in the 1860s, I defer to Matt, who I'm embarrassed to say how many decades younger than me you are, but it's a pleasure for me and a privilege to learn so much from you, as from others, half my age. Like all older people, I indulge in the fantasy which my wife and kids repeatedly disabuse me of, that I'm really young at heart and age is only superficial and this, that, and the other. Of course, that's not true, but I like to imagine it is. But I do believe a great counter to age is trying to learn from the people who are younger than us, who see the world afresh. Now, as I say, I am now seeing the 1830s and 40s not through the eyes of Palmerston, as I was taught to see it. I am seeing it through the eyes of Jens Stoltenberg. Because what we are doing today, what the West is doing today, and today, of course, France and Britain are both eagerly on the team, and the United States is today leading the team. We are developing, I have an old friend, lives in Israel, and he's been a friend for 40 years, and he fascinates me because I disagree with him on every pontification he ever makes. I won't mention his name for obvious reasons, none of you would know him, but he's a fool. And I find that whenever he makes a pontification on the wider world, all I have to do is go 180 degrees in the other direction to say no when he says yes. And it's automatically right. And a couple of years ago, he came out with one of his great thoughts for old ages. We needed a league, he said, of all the good nations, all the democratic and free nations against all the bad nations. And I said, that's a ludicrous idea. Of course, it had no impact on him because you're dealing with a fool. But first of all, once in a while you'll have the Nazis, or somebody like Stalin driving the Soviet Union to the ground, or Mao, who means well but is monumentally incompetent, and scores of millions of people die from his incompetence alone, right? Yes. But usually it's not that clear-cut and simple. It just isn't, right? And secondly, even where it is, so, my old tutor at Oxford, not an Englishman, a Central European Democrat who had survived the Nazis and the communists and fled to Britain. And he was under no illusions. He knew that the Soviet Union had won the war. And in 1939 and early 1940, Neville Chamberlain in Britain and most of his government wants to fight aggression they're already at war with Germany. And most of you, maybe all of you already know this, but I'd be interested to know if this comes as new to any of you. Neville Chamberlain's strategic conception was to fight Hitler by declaring war on Stalin, by sending the British army, which in fact was woefully incompetent at the time, as we know, to Finland. Now, the Finns saved human civilization by fighting so well against the Soviets that the British never had to come in. The British were able to prevaricate far longer, which at least meant that they didn't provoke a war against Stalin too. And my old teacher, who was in his late 60s and looked to be older at the time, he'd had a demanding life, Dr. Hans Schenk at Oxford, at Wolfson College, said to me rhetorically, Martin, what were they thinking? Were they mad? Were they insane? And of course the answer was yes, they were. Yes, they were. Now, there's an irony here. These people are the heirs, the grandchildren of the ruthless imperial grandmasters who put China on opium, impoverished Bengal and India, the richest economy in the world in the 18th century, reduced to destitution for the last 200 years by British imperial ravishing and rule, stole the oil of Iran, were only foiled by the treachery of one of their own top diplomats who advised the King of Saudi Arabia in the 20th century to make a better deal with America than he would have made with the British. These people plundered the entire world, right? They were also delivered for the slave trade. In the 1860s, we see them setting up a French empire under an Austrian archduke in Mexico, supported by French bayonets. It's pure occupation. Nobody in Mexico wants it. The only man who's stupid enough to believe it's really on behalf of the Mexican people is the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand himself at the time. Unfortunate name. His great nephew, of course, ends up getting assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, setting off another unpleasantness, right? But to the empire only lasts as long as French troops are there to prop it up. Once the rise of Prussia under Bismarck is threatening both France and Britain's power in continental Europe welded through France, Louis Napoleon sensibly brings his troops back home. And once his troops evacuate, also under the insistence of General Ulysses Grant, the real power in the United States, thank God, after the assassination of President Lincoln. And Grant refers to this later in Memories and Memoirs, right? He is insistent on implementing the Lincoln policy, that the Monroe Declaration policy must be upheld and no major European power must be allowed to have a significant foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And also they're opposed to slavery. And they see what these people are doing is an attempt to really keep the Confederacy alive south of the Confederacy by enslaving the Mexican people in a slave state. It happens anyway. The British and the French set up a genocidal regime in the 1870s in Mexico, which exterminates 600,000 Mexicans in their own concentration camps. It's very advanced and modern in that way, right? Before the Mexican Revolution starts in 1912 to 1914, which is, again, another story for another time. But look at what we're looking at. Britain and France, very small countries relative to the whole world. But together, they have reached a position of global power and ideological supremacy and confidence in their democratic institutions, that they use these democratic institutions to kill 1 million people in Russia in the Crimean War, 1854-55, to set off wars that destroy civilization in China and ultimately kill 60 to 80 million people, all in the name of free trade and westernization, and joining the global world order, the beneficent global world order in the 1850s and 1860s. They reimpose colonialism and slavery on Mexico in the 1860s at the point of French bayonets. Their influence in the United States is so strong that it makes the creation of the Confederacy possible, protected by the naval power of Britain and France in the 1860s. Now, the great champion of the Confederacy in the 1860s in Britain is a very interesting man. He is the ideological father of liberalism in America as well as Britain. And if you look at his domestic policies, and his foreign trade policies, they are identical to Ronald Reagan's 120 years later. His name is William Ewart Gladstone, known as the People's William. If you read the English, there's an English historian loved by American conservatives, Paul Johnson, right? And he loves Gladstone. Gladstone is his god, right? Who was Gladstone? Where did he come from? The family was incredibly wealthy. They were at billionaire levels, much more in relative terms relative to Bill Gates than to Donald Trump today. The money was entirely made from the slave trade. His father was the largest slave trader in the world through the port of Liverpool. Gladstone came into politics in the 1830s as an arch conservative. In the 1860s, he is already acclaimed as the great champion of rising democracy in Britain, popular because in the short term, the working classes of Britain are being bribed by cheaper food by abolishing protective tariffs. There is a short-term benefit for them, but British agriculture collapses, and eventually British industry collapses too, and this is all Gladstone's doing, right? But in 1862, after the 7 Days Campaign of Robert E. Lee, has smashed the Army of the Potomac yet again and made a horse's ass yet again of General George McClellan. Lincoln had a gift for loser generals. Churchill had the same. Actually, so did Ben-Gurion in Israel. They all fancied themselves as military geniuses, and they weren't. Lincoln is eventually rescued by Ulysses S. Grant, still vastly underrated to this day. Churchill is rescued by Montgomery, who Churchill lovers try to deny from history, and who Americans hate because he isn't American and because he's better than Patton, right? And in Israel, Diane is kept down, and the great general of 1948, Yigal Allon, is never allowed by Ben-Gurion to command an army again because Ben-Gurion is simply jealous of him. He's simply jealous of him. And Allon is the great architect of Israel's victory against truly impossible odds in the 1948 war. Okay, we slightly digress there. But back again in the Civil War, Robert E. Lee has trounced the Union yet again. And Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, a man who will dominate its politics as Prime Minister for the next 35 years, gets up and says, the Confederates have succeeded in creating an army. We must conclude that they have therefore also created a nation. To the father of liberalism, the fact that the Confederacy is established on grounds of slave ownership is irrelevant and perhaps even in their favor. And Palmerston dies in 1865, but his successor is already emerging. Again, a world-significant figure whose real role in history has never been seriously analyzed properly, even though it's staring us in the plain face. The mastermind and the architect of the enslavement of Africa. Robert Gascoigne Cecil, descendant of Lord Burleigh, the famous first minister of Queen Elizabeth I, 300 years before, right? And he becomes Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister of Britain virtually in perpetuum from 1886 to 1902. And before that, its guiding figure as Foreign Secretary, the man who accompanies Benjamin Disraeli to meet and size up with Tsar Alexander II at the and his ministers, at least, I don't think the Tsar went in person, but he certainly meets the chief ministers of the Tsar at the Congress of Berlin in 1878. And from that moment, Tsar Alexander is a dead man, because Robert Gascoigne Cecil correctly concludes that he is the most formidable figure supporting first Lincoln and then Bismarck in the creation of major industrial powers held together by railroads, which he is also working on in Russia, which will end the domination of Britain and France. The age of domination of Britain and France has already ended. There is a very specific moment when it ends. In 1870, they've had a huge setback already. Their setback is the victory of Lincoln and the preservation of the Union across the entire United States in the Civil War, right? In the Civil War. And again, as you'll have gathered, I have a taste for unconventional reading in history and analysis. And there is a writer of alternative histories, you know, the histories that didn't happen but might have, who was a genius. He actually started out as a professor of Byzantine history in California and discovered that the market for lecturers in Byzantine history in 21st century and late 20th century California was very weak. So he sensibly went into writing science fiction instead. His name is Harry Turtledove, and he is enormously prolific. And Turtledove wrote an extraordinary sequence of 11 novels, each of them about 500 pages long, each of them filled with historical detail. What would have happened if the Confederacy had won the Civil War, become an independent nation, remained, of course, the archenemy of the Union as they were of the Confederacy, and therefore World War I and World War II were fought out simultaneously in North America, with the same technologies and weapons and systems and ideologies that we saw in Europe. Now, this is a work of genius. I recommend it to you. I would start with the first one, How Few Remain, which is how a Stonewall Jackson, still alive in 1880, whips the Union's ass again. And it finally emerges on the rather dim minds of the American leaders at the time that since Germany has the best army in the world, they might do better to link up with Germany, since the British and the French were supporting the Confederacy. Now, even in our world, this has 20th century repercussions which are extraordinary and enormous. Because in World War I and World War II, the great centers of political isolation to oppose entry into the war were the Germans of the Midwest and the Irish of the industrial cities to the Northeast. In World War I, they are joined, improbable in the light of later developments, with the Jewish immigrants from Russia who hate the Tsar like poison. So there are three great, in terms of population, enormous groups of ethnics in the United States who oppose going into World War I. The Germans, the Irish, and the Jews. By the time of World War II, the Germans and the Irish are more hard-boiled. My mother would have said, using German terms, verbrennte, hard-boiled. They are more hard-boiled than ever. The Jews, of course, have moved into the interventionist camp because Hitler is a genocidal maniac, and his threat, at least in general terms, is obvious and well recognized, right? But where are the countervailing centers for internationalism? Well, of course, you find it, as you would expect, in Wall Street. Although this is a recent development, as we should see, that only stems from World War I. Before then, Wall Street is very hostile in general, in deep terms, to the City of London. They are rivals. But after World War I, New York has eclipsed the City of London so much that they don't worry about the sinister British anymore. That's another story. And we may touch upon it. What you find, though, is that the great center of support for Britain and France in both world wars in America is the Confederacy. It's in the Confederacy. And this has deep roots back. The Confederacy has a Jewish Secretary of War. This doesn't mean the Jewish world is in favor of slavery or in favor of the Confederacy. What it means is, and I saw it in Ireland, both sides of the border growing up, Jewish communities everywhere tend to become super patriots. They overcompensate, as we see with other groups too. They tend to go with militaristic groups as well. They love to wave the flag. They even volunteer in disproportionate numbers. The number of German Jews who won the Iron Cross and who died in action in World War I was far higher than the general statistical figure. When these findings were made by the German army in the 1920s, because they were very good at statistical studies, they suppressed them immediately because their officer corps was already highly anti-Semitic, and they didn't want to know these inconvenient facts, and so they suppressed them. But that was the way of it. So the Union soldiers are very patriotic for the Union in the Civil War and for Lincoln and for freedom. But in the South, they defined freedom as Robert E. Lee and the freedom to hold slaves. And their highly efficient Secretary of State and Secretary of War through the Civil War, the Albert Speer of the Confederacy, who keeps it fighting against all odds, is a high-profile Jewish lawyer, Judah Benjamin. And the Union wants to arrest him and try him for treason after the war. And who protects him? Why, the British Empire does. Judah P. Benjamin flees to London qualifies at the bar to be an advocate in the British legal system, becomes a hugely popular and successful one. He's doubly exotic. He's not just obviously Jewish. He's a courtly Southern gentleman at the same time, right? Lo and behold. But the key to the success of the first NATO is twofold. First, they live a lie. They actually destroy civilizations around the world. They do so in Russia, China, India, when the British put down the Indian Mutiny, which that is their term for it. The Indian term is a very different term to this day. They call it the First War of National Liberation. But it's just a mutiny to the British Empire. And that's the way it's therefore remembered in American education as well. The First War of Indian Liberation sees several thousand British killed, often in the most brutal and vicious of circumstances, but it sees more than 1 million Indian peasants and non-combatant citizens killed by the British Army as they burn their way across northern India to teach a lesson never to rise again. And it works. Why else does Gandhi revert to quote-unquote non-violence? He isn't non-violent against the Muslims. He kills 50,000 Muslims in sectarian riots from 1918 to 1945. That's why Pakistan developed. If you look at the movie Gandhi, it tells a lie, of course. It tells a lie approved of by the Indian government and also by the British government, that the British are really humane and kind at heart, that the Hindus are high-minded and inclusive and love to have the Muslims, but it was an evil British plot, according to the movie, that creates Pakistan. No, it was not. The British supported the Hindus all the way until Gandhi, who could be an idiot at times, like Churchill, they hated each other, of course. But Gandhi, in 1942, declares in favor of the Japanese. And this is a key factor in the fall of Singapore, because 45,000 Indian troops surrender at Singapore in 1942, early 1942 to the Japanese, and 40,000 of them immediately re-enlist in the Japanese army to fight the British in the war into India. And none of them ever go home, or at least some of them quietly are allowed to under Nehru. But the British basically kill many of them because they're brave and idealistic in their own way. And they get killed in the Japanese campaigns against India. Again, when the British and the Imperial armies have an outstanding general in the East, unknown in America. But he ranks with Montgomery as one of the two great British generals of the war. His name is William Slim. He's worth looking up. He's a very interesting man. He's multi-ethnic in his army. There are as many West Africans fighting to defend the British Empire as there are Indians, and twice as many West Africans from Nigeria primarily are in the British 14th Army in Burma, as British combat soldiers are there. And Slim holds them all together. He's a true imperial general. He's a very interesting man. But all these developments stem from the British crushing of India. So look at what we've got. We've got the first NATO. We've got a movement that from 1839 to 1870 welds power across Eurasia and around the world, is not afraid of waging full-scale wars against Russia and China and India and Mexico, and also against the Austrian Empire, by the way, in 1859, to secure the unification of Italy, and more free trade rights for the British, of course, and more properties for the British, right? And all these wars are fought and easily won with minimum casualties on the side of the NATO forces. Is this starting to sound familiar? Except whereas over the last 30 years, we, through NATO, have bombed them, the bad guys, whether they're Orthodox Christians and Slavs, or whether they're Arab Muslims, or whoever they are, right? We bomb them. We're used to easy victories in the wars, right? Another outstanding testimony from later British cultural history. Anyone here remember Brideshead Revisited, that wonderful TV series, which was based from a very slow novella by Evelyn Waugh? Evelyn Waugh ranks with George Orwell as one of the two greatest British writers of the 20th century, and he's a master of fiction, which Orwell was not. He's not usually regarded as a politically significant figure. He could be an apparently absurd figure. He was a devout Catholic, so much so that he embarrassed mainstream British Catholic establishment of his own time. He writes like a dream. His novels are usually less than 200 pages long. And they're packed with wisdom and humor and insight and political incorrectness. He writes about the corruption and instability of emerging nations in a fictional East African nation he calls Ishmaelia. And he calls the book Black Mischief, which is why no American lecturer will dare to discuss it today. And I recommend it to you. I worked in Kazakhstan, the nation of Kazakhstan, for 3 years, which is not black, which is not African. But the conditions War describes in Black Mischief, I realized I was working in, and understanding the kind of people I was among and the kind of cynicism I was functioning among helped me make a good living for several years when I was persona non grata back here in America because of my opposition to the Iraq War and the Bush administration, and to the Obama administration after it. So Evelyn Waugh helped me personally in my career and my survival, right? But what I recommend to you is his novel Scoop, about a satire on the British press service, because he covered the Italian conquest of Ethiopia in 1935-36 for the London Daily Express. So he writes a novel about it. And in his novel, the Daily Express is the Daily Beast. And its arch rival is the Daily Mail to this day, the great British supreme popular tabloid in the world, with a hugely popular American edition. And the hero character, William Booth, a naive, innocent young Englishman, is brought in the novel before the publisher of the Daily Beast, who in real life was Lord Beaverbrook, Winston Churchill's friend for 50 years, the great Canadian imperialist, right? And what does Lord Copper, who is Lord Beaverbrook, in the novel, his very simple boot, he says, we want a British victory at minimum casualties, we want maximum glory, right? Fascists, bad. Communists, bad. British interests, good. And we want it all over in a couple of weeks. That's what we want, Boot. Right? That's the way they saw the world. And isn't that the way that all our wars of the past 25 years have been sold to the American people and their allies as well? We want a nice, glorious victory, drop the bombs on them, get them to surrender. We're in there, kill the bad guys. After 2 weeks, it's over. Of course, 20 years later and $1 trillion wasted in corruption, we're still there in every case. But you don't see that covered in the media to the same degree. But what we are seeing today in conclusion, and thank you for letting me go on at such length, is a lesson learned from the history of the first NATO. This has all happened before. All my idiot friends who say we need a league of democracies against all the bad guys are not just simplistic fools. They are blind to the lessons of history, because there was a league of democracies. And of course, if you go back to Greek history, you find it in Thucydides, Athens and its empire, spreading slavery in the name of spreading freedom. And they come up against a mean, tough little enemy who they can't beat, Sparta. And who wins in the end? The Spartans do, of course. It's the end of the golden age of Greece. So this is an old lesson, but you don't have to go that far back. If you go back to the 1840s and 50s, remember, I didn't have to research any new facts to give you this presentation. I know all these facts for 50 years. They're all in the history books. They're all there. If you want a very good fictionalized recreation of the era, wonderfully done, I recommend the Flashman novels by George MacDonald Fraser. They're old news to you, Jim, I see, of course. And I'm sure you'll join me in praising them. I mean, the irony is George MacDonald Fraser was a combat soldier, and it shows, fighting in Burma under Slim's army against the Japanese in World War II. But he recreates all the epic British imperial conquests from the 1830s in Afghanistan, all the way through the Franco-Prussian War, all the way through to the end, and he makes the era live, and he brings it to life for you. But as I say, he brings it to life. But for the perspective I'm giving you, I owe it to my own muse and aspiration, Jen Stoltenberg. Thank you very much. And thank you for staying with me through all this.